We are in lesson 6, and my intentions are to try and finish lesson 6 tonight. We'll see what happens, but John Calvin happens to be one of the best known reformers, aside from Martin Luther. Actually, probably more so than Martin Luther in a lot of circles, depends on who you talk to. But John Calvin, Calvinism. That's where that term comes from, and it's from what he sort of developed. We have this general progression. Again, we've seen Catholic Church was the majority, and again, it still is to this day. But then we had this Reformation movement that moved out of trying to counteract some of the teachings of the Catholic Church. And Martin Luther really spearheaded that. The last time we saw was Zwingli as well, who jumped in on this. And they had some differing opinions, and everything's just sort of a progression. We started with a certain premise, and you just keep adding to it over time. And that's where we are actually with the Protestant Reformation as well. Some of the things that Martin Luther said, Zwingli, I think, expounded on a little bit. And now we're going to see John Calvin taking it not necessarily a different direction, but he's really going to hone in on some points and some things that we're going to look at. Any thoughts, questions, comments, concerns over any of the Reformation movement to this point? Oh, yeah.
Clear me up on, do you think the Reformation was that like to kind of reform the Catholic Church in an essence, instead of, trying to develop a new system or anything? I mean, I'm not real clear on that, I guess.
I would say yes. I think the Reformation movement, it seems like all of the early reformers especially were really trying to make a difference in the church itself. Yeah. I mean, they were Catholic, they grew up Catholic, and they wanted to help the fellow Catholics. And they were just like, guys, here's some things that we're doing wrong, and we need to fix this. But what happens, though, when you do that and you take that approach, if you have people that aren't willing to change, then you have this, well, no, we're just not going to pay attention to you, get away. That's why a lot of them were excommunicated, like cut off from the church. And then at that point, what do? I mean, what's your only option? You just keep going with it. And so I think that's the position they were forced into. I do think that there was a lot of they tried a lot to help people see, Catholicism. We need to change this, and we need to do better. But as usually happens, you have people that they're continuing to do what they've always done because of the tradition and all that. So I don't think it was they intended, and I think some of them come out and say we never intended to have like our own thing. But that's how it ended up. And it's interesting because a lot of what the reformers were reforming, that's not a hard word, but I'm struggling right now. Reformers, they were trying to get away from a lot of things that the Catholic Church was doing. But there was this, I don't know, they had a lot of power, and they exerted that power. And one thing that we noticed with some of the reformers is once they started to get a following, they used more of that power than I think they set out in the beginning, intending to, or whatever. But it really turned into that. And we're going to see that at the end of this lesson with Calvin, some of the things that he did, especially in the city that he ended up in. But Geneva. That was it. Yeah. He was in Zurich for a while, right? Anyway, let's look at this a little bit. So, John Calvin, what would you say his background was? What did that look like?
Very bright.
Yeah, real smart.
Well, and he was raised Roman Catholic too.
Yeah. Raised Roman as you would be. Not, and again, like we're speaking in generalities, not everybody, but that was majority view, so that makes sense. So he was really smart. Now remember, Martin Luther came from a very poor background. Is that the same here? No, it's like firmly upper middle class, and so they were up there, and so he had access to all kinds of higher learning and all of those things. Now, when he was in college, what sorts of things did he study? Yeah, law. There was some theology in there and all of that, but it was mainly based on law. And so he really had his logical mind working with that. And so a lot of what you see Calvin teach is like logical arguments. And I like how it put it. He was not a speaker of the people or something.
Man of the people.
Man of the people. Yeah, there you go. Like he was not a man of the people. Which when you hear that, it's like, why didn't anybody listen to him?
Well, the next line says he spoke to learned at all times, like he would speak over my head for sure.
Oh yeah, mine too. And so I mean, he does that, and he approaches things on a very scholarly level. Now, if you think about what that does to people, like one, if you're a scholar and he's making logical sense, you're like, all right, yeah, I'll follow that. If you're not very smart and you hear this, like you might think, oh, he sounds pretty good. I don't know. Like we'll just go with it. And that happens sometimes. And yeah, we all.
Appeal to authority comes into play quite a bit.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. If you speak confidently enough, people will believe you. Yeah, that's well, never mind. We have this thing where if we act like we are an authority figure, people sometimes they'll just, oh, okay, that's what we're going to do. And okay, I'm not going to say that that's what Calvin was doing, but that is definitely, his approach was a high-level, highly rationalized, logical approach. And this is why Calvinism in general is a system, when you think about Calvinism, it's really this intricate system. And the 5 points of Calvinism, what are they? Tulip. Yeah, here you go. So you have those 5 points of Calvinism. All of those points are very much interconnected. And the way this works is it's sort of like a whole system of belief. And so that's why if you hold on to one point of Calvinism, you have to have all of them, or it doesn't really make sense. I will say, as a side note, there are people who claim to be 4-point Calvinists, and they don't agree with the limited atonement thing. That's the one that, if you're a 4-point Calvinist, you would say, no, we don't support that. And which, by the way, what is limited atonement?
Christ sacrifices only for a certain number of folks.
Yeah.
For the ones that were good.
Yeah.
Unconditional, whatever the U is. Unconditional elect. Those unconditional elected is who the atonement was for.
Right, exactly. So, yeah, in typical fashion, I started right in the middle so we could go both ways. That's what you're supposed to do, right? Yeah, that limited atonement thing, saying that the sacrifice that Jesus did on the cross, he died for, and we would say, for the sins of everyone. But, even then, we say he died for the sins of everyone. Does that mean everyone's saved? No. Because not everyone accepts that sacrifice. Not everyone obeys what he says to do. So, if that's the case, then if you think about it, and you're not using scripture, but you're using logic to think through this, it's like, well, was that sacrifice really for everybody then? If only the people who will actually be saved actually are saved, then really his sacrifice only really counted for that, because the people who aren't going to be saved, where's their sins are still on them. So Jesus' sacrifice wasn't really for their sins. Do you see how you could logically rationalize it and get to that point?
So in essence, he really did believe in free will.
Not at all. Yeah, that's exactly right. And I think that's the basis. Well, I wouldn't say it's the basis, but that is the conclusion you have to come to. Because that's the only way this logically works. Because either we have free will and that's not true, or we don't have free will, everything is predetermined, and God is making all the decisions and causing everything to happen as well. And so it reveals a lot about your thoughts of the nature of God, of who he is. A lot of times you'll hear Calvinists say that God is sovereign, and meaning he has total control. It's his choice. He does whatever he wants to do, and his actions, he predetermined everything before the foundation of the world, and everything that's happening is because God wanted that to happen. So every single decision that you make isn't really your decision, because God has done that. Now, this is a development of what some of the previous reformers were teaching. You might have seen something toward the end of the Zwingli lesson about how it was, well, let's look at that. I don't remember the exact quote. It was before the Anabaptist section. So at the end of lesson 5, there's like this little insert thing. Sort of halfway down, the paragraph begins, Zwingli was the most humanistic of the reformers. If you go down a little bit, he says he accepted unconditional predestination to salvation, but believed that only those who heard and rejected the gospel in unbelief were predestined to condemnation. So there's a thing when it comes to predestination, and Calvin taught something called double predestination. That not only did God choose who would be saved, but he chose that everyone else would be lost too. And so God makes the choice of who is going to be saved and go to heaven, and who is going to be lost and be eternally punished in hell. And so that's double predestination, and that is what Calvin will say. Zwingli wasn't really about the double predestination. He agreed you were predestined to be saved, but what happens to those who don't believe? Well, if you're someone who hears the word and just totally ignores it, disbelieves, then yeah, you're going to be punished. But if you don't hear the word at all, then I think he was an annihilationist when it came to that you would just be wiped from existence. I think that's the truth there. So we have this progression of things, and a lot of this goes back to our concept of original sin. Because if original sin is a thing, and at the end of the Zwingli thing, it talks about how he did not view original sin as we inherit the guilt. It's just because of what happened, we live in a fallen world, and we're susceptible to what's happening, and we're likely to sin because of the fallen world that we're in. When you're talking to someone who's a Calvinist, be ready for a long discussion. It's going to be a long conversation because there's a lot of areas to cover and there's a lot of things to say. And again, remember John Calvin's background. He was law mindset and logical. Calvinism is extremely logical internally, meaning that if you start at a certain point, all of these things would fall into place, and it's consistent with their own worldview. So you just know that this whole thing is really well thought out in a lot of ways.
But I think that's the Achilles heel
Yes.
of it.
Yes.
Because if it all interrelates, if you can disprove one point of the tulip, then the whole thing falls apart.
Exactly. And that's what we got to keep in mind. That even though there's so many things and so many ways that people look at this, it's confusing, and what do you do with it? Well, just focus on one thing, because again, this has to be internally consistent, and not only. And here's the thing I'm leaving out, if you didn't notice, this is internally consistent from a logical standpoint. But the question is it consistent scripturally? Do we see Scripture saying the same things as these 5 points of Calvinism? And I think that's where we really need to focus and hone in and pay attention. And so, we got to be careful with how we approach that. Now, let's think through some of this a bit. Now, as far as the background goes, I think we're pretty good, pretty set there. But let's look at the 5 points of Calvinism. Tulip.
So did Calvin call him? Did he say, I've got this, and y'all need to remember it's called tulip, or did that come later?
I don't think it was from right off the bat.
Okay.
I don't know if he came up with it or not. I'm not sure.
And do practicing, whatever, Baptist, whatever, do they say we if I went to the ex-church, would they say we're Calvinists and we believe the tulip?
Some would. Some don't.
There's been a lot of change in that in the last few years, and especially on the total depravity because of infants. And
Right.
I don't know that that's what happened, but I understood that's why First Baptist
that's been a huge point of division and especially in the Baptist church. That's been one thing, because historically Baptists are more in line with Calvinism. You hear things, especially the P, perseverance of the saints, once saved, always saved. That's ultimately what it gets to. That is a typical Baptist doctrine. And again, with any kind of system of religion we're talking about, there are some that hold to certain things and some that don't. But just in general, that seems to be where they are with that. When it comes to other, while we're on the subject, other groups that would definitely say that they're Calvinists, anyone who says that they are part of the Reformed theology movement. So you'll hear people calling themselves Reformed. And that's what they mean. That essentially they're hardcore Calvinists. They accept all 5 points of Calvinism, and they'll teach those. And usually, I think it's the Westminster Confession. I'll have to look that up. But they like that, typically. Anyways, there's that. There are certain types of Baptist churches that typically are Calvinist. And there's some Presbyterian. I don't think it's all, but I think there's some of that. But you will have some people that say, yes, I'm a Calvinist, here's what I believe. And Tulip, yes. You'll have some people that don't. Actually, the first real discussion I had with someone who was a Calvinist did not claim to be a Calvinist. And when we were studying together, it was like the more we talked, because one of the first questions, so are you a Calvinist? She was like, no. But then the more we talked, it's like, so you believe in total depravity? Yes. Okay. You believe in unconditional? Okay. And then we went through, it's like, you do all of these things, right? And so just because someone doesn't claim the name, sometimes, the doctrine is in line. And so it depends on how it's been taught. So I wouldn't go into a discussion saying, you're a Calvinist, I know exactly what you believe. That is probably not a good way to do it. Probably not a good way to do anything for the most part. But these are the points, though, that if you hold to this system of belief, these are the points you will hold to. So the first one, total inherited depravity. What's that in a nutshell?
Born sinful from the get-go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're born completely sinful. You inherit the guilt. So even as an infant, you are responsible for the sin that came before you. It's essentially going back to Adam's sin. So this is original sin. That's where it really comes from and comes down to. And so because of that, we are born guilty. And since we're born guilty, totally depraved, there's nothing good about us. There's nothing good that we could ever possibly do. So there's no good thing that humans could ever do. And that's the worldview that you have to have if you go along with this. Now, taking that, the U, unconditional election, what is that?
God chooses who he's going to save.
Yeah, there you go. So God is sovereign. God makes the choice. We can't do anything. And what they will say, a lot of times what people will say, they'll look at passages that talk about us being dead in our sin, and they'll say, well, if you're dead in your sin, people who are dead can't do anything. So how could you say that you are going to respond to God's message? You can't hear because you're dead. You can't do anything because you are dead. In order for you to do something, God has to give you life first. God has to make that choice to regenerate you so you can do that. And that actually bleeds into the I, irresistible grace, a little bit as well. Because it's God who's doing it, it's not you. You are dead, you are totally depraved, there's nothing that you can do. So don't you try to say that you're doing anything in salvation. So that's kind of where that goes.
And I'm assuming, and I guess our books say that they get that, most of that from Ephesians 1, 4 through 8, where it talks about just as you chose us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love, having predestined us to the adoption of sons by Jesus Christ to himself, according to his good pleasure. So they take that very, very, very literally. Each one of us are predestined. I think we would say that is in my mind, and I wrote this down here, a category of believers. Those who are obedient to God's word are the ones that are predestined.
Right.
I mean, there is a group of people who are going to be saved, and it's those people who are obedient to God's word, not individually me or individually you.
Right. And that's the way, yeah, we have to really understand what he's saying there, because the Bible teaches predestination. Like, there's no doubt about it. Like, it's right there. And if we say it doesn't, then when we look at this passage, what do you do with it? Because the word is literally right there. So, got to do something with it.
How do they explain that the baby's born into sin? And they often quote the verse, if you call upon the name of the Lord, you can be saved. And it's obvious that a 1-year-old cannot call upon the Lord, so till they're 10 years old or 12 years old, and they obey the gospel, or they just, you're in a lost situation.
Well, what they would say is God, if he has predetermined that that person is going to be saved, even if they die as an infant, God knows that he is regenerating them. And that given the chance, they would respond because God knows that they will respond because he's going to make them respond. But if they die, it's okay because God has already made that choice anyway. And that's where you have to go. That's where you have to get to. And I don't want to misrepresent anything. I think that is how they would view that. There might be something else there that I'm missing, but I do think that's the thought.
Okay. I just find it, I guess maybe interesting is the right word, that it seems like John Calvin, with being law, he would be a very logical but very literal thinker. And I've learned throughout my personal experiences that some of you know about with having a literal thinking child. It's taught me a lot because I can read between the lines, and so I can see the hidden message or the underlying meaning of things. And some people just can't. They take words at their face value, and if predestined means predestined, or dead means dead. There's no innuendos. They don't understand innuendos. And I don't know to be interested or sad, because if you are a literal thinker and you read it exactly how it says, I mean, we have to believe that God hopefully is gracious enough, you know what I mean? Like, and they don't, that's the way they understand it. I don't know, it's heartbreaking and interesting all at the same.
It is. It really is. And this is why it's really important for us to, as much as lies within us, not to treat the Bible as a law book. Don't look at the Bible as a list of rules. This is what you do. Don't do this, but make sure you do this. Because that's not how the Bible is written. Now, if you come from a background where it's like very, a law background, maybe that's the way you look at it. But really, if you look at the Bible, there's a lot of narrative. There's some poetry. There's history. And then there's all kinds of those sorts of things. And so you have to understand what was being said to the original audience. And then, what does that tell us about God? What does it tell us about his plan? And then, after all that, let's get to the application to us. And that's a challenge for some people, especially if we're stuck on the law aspect of it. Because, saying that the Bible is God's rule book for how to live your life, okay, yeah. But, think about how how it was written and what it was written for. Because that's a challenge.
Well, it makes it really hard too. If you have an answer, please. Because we know that God is all knowing. Mm-hmm. He knows everything that's going to happen. And the thing with, predestination is, well, he knows whether I'm going to go to heaven or hell. And then the argument of, but he constantly pursues us. If he knows, why is he still pursuing? And I don't know. If you got an answer for that, please let me know.
Humans, I can't comprehend how you can know the end of something, but not be causing it to happen.
Right.
I don't know how that works. God can do it.
I
I think with predestination, God has set the conditions by which a person is saved, and you make the decision. It's just like an analogy that helps me understand, and please let me know if there are any holes in it, is every boy in America between the age of like 8 and 18 is predestined to be a Boy Scout. But they have to go to a scoutmaster, and say, I want to be a Boy Scout in order to become one.
Yeah.
The conditions are set, but then the kids need to do their part to become a Boy Scout. And it's the same for us to become a Christian. God has set the conditions, and it's our decision whether we choose to become a Christian.
Then you recall if you were chosen.
Okay, can I jump on that too? Maybe
Do it.
like, where God has placed eternity in our hearts, right? We know that from Ecclesiastes, right, Solomon? And so that is our predestination. That is where we are supposed to go. But whether or not we take the directions like a map and go the right way, or we choose to veer off on some country road and sightsee, is our choice. But our predestination, our purpose, where we're supposed to go, is eternity with God.
That's a good way to look at it.
We're predestined, really.
I think as Mickey said a moment ago, if you're gonna go into argument with them and say that it doesn't teach predestination, you're in deep water, because it does teach predestination. What it teaches, though, is predestination. Those that are predestinated are those that are obedient and do what God said. So it's not wrong to say that it teaches predestination. It does.
Yeah.
But it is wrong to say that it's predestined an individual without them having anything to do.
True. Yeah. And I think that's the distinction. And again, there are so many hard questions and so many things, because a lot of this, it does get into the nature of how does God do what he says he does? And we're not given that information for most things. And so, answering questions of how or why, that's really hard. But what we can answer is, well, this is what God said. And, this is the information we have, and we're going to go with that. So anybody who claims to know, like, for sure, well, this is why God said that, or this is how he's going to accomplish that, be careful. Because, that's presuming a lot of ourselves. So that's tough. It's some intense stuff. So we've talked about L a little bit, limited atonement. Just in keeping up with this logical approach, if we're totally depraved, there's nothing that we can do on our own. And God is the one who chooses. He chooses who is saved and he chooses who is not. Then the sacrifice of Christ, as we were saying a second ago, that it's only really for those people who are going to be saved. God already knows who it is, and so this sacrifice is essentially just for those people. Because since the other people are predestined to be lost, that sacrifice isn't going to do anything for them. So, this is only for this certain group of people. Which sort of relates to the next thing as well, the I, irresistible grace. And this, since God is the one who makes the decision, there's nothing that we can do. His grace, therefore, is irresistible. It's something that if he chooses you to be renewed, to come to the knowledge of his truth, he is going to choose you, but you can't do it on your own. He has to regenerate you first. So, if you're talking to someone who is Reformed theology, and they're really consistent with their viewpoint, what they have to say is that salvation, justification, really happens before you believe. It happens before you repent. It happens before all of that, because you can't do anything to make yourself right with God. It's God who makes that choice, and he regenerates you to have the ability to obey and come to him. And so there's nothing really that I can do individually. It doesn't matter if I try really hard. if God has chosen me to not accept the truth, then it doesn't matter if I try, if I believe with all my heart, I'm doing all these things. Doesn't matter because God has made the choice that you are not one of the chosen. You're not part of that group.
We're told several times God's not a respecter of persons. How can he not be a respecter of persons if he does that?
I think that's one of the I think most basic, simple things to bring up in a discussion like this. Because really, that's what it comes down to. Because if there's really nothing at all that we can do, and God is the one who makes that choice, that is the ultimate level of respecting persons. Because really, what it says, there's nothing that I can do. If I'm saved, it doesn't matter if I completely turn my back on God and go and do whatever. Perseverance of the saints, that's the last one. It doesn't matter because God has said that I will be, I'm accepted. I'm one of the elect. Now, here's something that I will say as a side note to that. I think what a lot of Calvinists would say is that, well, if you are not living your life for God, that proves that you were never saved to begin with, and that you were never one of God's people. And so, it doesn't matter how many years you served God, you look like you were, you never really truly believed because God never really truly renewed you, regenerated you. And so, all of this, it wasn't true. But, on the flip side of that, if God has chosen you to be one of the elect, then it doesn't matter what's going to happen, you are going to be faithful. Now you will have two major different camps on this. I think what Calvin would have taught and what some Calvinists today teach is that the people who are truly faithful are the ones who are doing what God says and following what the Bible says. And doing all of those things. And so it's not a license to sin. It's not saying that, well, do whatever you want, because if you're elect, God's going to save you, and if you're not, then, whatever. So just do whatever. They're saying that, God has regenerated you, so because of that, you will do the right thing. As opposed to, I think there are some people who take this with a license, like a liberty. It's like, well, it doesn't really matter what I do, because God's got me. And that's the way they look at grace. So you do have a couple of those.
But if you carry it to its logical conclusion, then it ultimately leads to, I can live however I want, because God has already chosen me. So I can go out and sin and do anything that I want, because God has predestined that I'm going to be saved.
And what they would say is that God will make you come back. God will make you do the right thing at some point. Or even if you die in that state, well, you've been regenerated. So, God knows your heart because he's the one who gave you that. So that is what.
What's the point of religion? I mean, what's the point of?
Honestly.
I mean, what's the
yes.
point for them?
It's very depressing.
It really is. And if you really think about it, what's the point of trying to convince someone else? Because if they are God's elect, God will restore them, and God will regenerate them. And so there's a lot to be said about then why are we even bothered? And I think what some of them would say is that, well, this is what God wants, and so this is what I'm going to do.
But why? To me, that just means that Christ's death was for nothing.
Right.
I mean, wow, I'm
Did these
just
people,
astonished
did
at this.
these people not read the Old Testament and what he did to his own chosen people?
I think the problem is if you start with a concept of God that isn't biblically accurate, then the way you read things and the way that you interpret Scripture. So like things like the book of Romans, Calvinists go to the book of Romans a lot, especially like chapter 9, talking about Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated, and how he hardened Pharaoh's heart. And it's like, look at what God did to all these people. And he made the choice, he made the choice of Jacob before Esau and Jacob were even born. Like, he already had made that choice. And so they will look at passages like that and be like, well, okay, see, You know, all that, everything we see in the Old Testament is just God is showing that He is sovereign and He is doing these things and He's working it out how He wants. And if that's your mindset, that's how you, I mean, it's obviously how you have to read these passages. But I think it's hard to break that habit, because once you get that in your mind and you read the passages like that, it's hard to look at it from any different angle. And so that it makes these conversations tricky and very difficult to have. And that's why I think it is important, back to what Aaron said a while back, that it's such a well-oiled machine. It goes all together. Find one thing and focus on one thing. Here's what I like. I like to focus on the whole depravity of humans. What do we do with Ezekiel 18 if we have this mindset view? So I don't know if you had time to look at Ezekiel 18 and think about what was said there. But that passage talks a lot about how there was this proverb that the people in captivity in Babylon were saying. It's like, well, the fathers ate the grapes, and remember what happened to the teeth of the sons?
Set on edge.
Yeah, they were set on edge. It was like, fathers ate the sour grapes, and then it's affecting the children. And so it's like, it's not our fault, it's what they did. And God says in chapter 18, I think very clearly in the first 23 verses, no, the soul that sins, it shall die. Doesn't matter if your father was the greatest person ever, and then you grow up and you choose to do wrong, you're going to be guilty for that. But if you grew up and you were doing wrong, and then you decided to change your life around and you are going to do right now, then he's not going to hold the wrong against you. But if you, then that guy had a son, and that son grew up, and he was doing all the right things, but then he had totally abandoned God and started doing the wrong things. What he said there is, I'm not going to remember the good things that you did, because this is how you ended up. And we are responsible for our actions. I think that is an important passage to really hone in on and think through logically how that works.
Yeah, Ezekiel 18:20, I think just the bedrock of that. The soul who sins shall die. I don't know what you do with that. The son shall not bear the guilt of the father, nor the father bear the guilt of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself.
Yeah. And so think about that. Keep that in mind. Look at Romans 5. Because Romans 5 is used a lot of times to try to teach original sin. That the sin of Adam is transferred to everyone else. But how do we think about that in line with what Mickey just read in Ezekiel 18:20? Look at, so in Romans 5, you look at verse 12. Yeah, there we go. Therefore, just as through one man sin entered the world, and death through sin, and death spread to all men because of sin. So, how did sin enter the world? According to the verse.
By man.
Yeah, through one man. And so, because of that, sin spread to everybody. Is that all the verse says? So if it's not, so think about how you have to view this through a Calvinistic standpoint.
It's not entirely wrong, but we're all born in a sinful world, and, we're told that all have sinned, and, so it's not 100%, but see, that's what Satan likes to do. He likes to take it and just twist it, not completely change it.
Yes, exactly. And that's where you have to really dive in and think logically through this. How does this fit with other things that we know? But if you look just very carefully at how this is structured. So, okay, you have one man, through one man, sin entered in the world. And what are the wages of sin? Death. He's already established that in Romans, so we've already seen that. But because of that, death spread to all men. But the very last phrase in that verse is really important. Because all sin. The reason that we are all bound for death is because we all sin. And just because it was through one man's actions that sin entered the world in the first place, and the consequences of sin is death. And, take it a step further, everybody is guilty and deserves death. The reason, though, is because each and every one of us have sinned as well. There's all kinds of ways you can look at this, but I think you gotta keep this separate. You know, sin is the cause of what brings the consequence of death. And because of what Adam did, we live in a fallen world, and we all have the choice. I think we can't oversell that. We have the choice to either sin or not. But we are responsible because we have sinned, and we deserve that death. I think it's important to also look at this from the other side of this as well. Verse 16, talking about the gift of Christ and what He gave. If it's true, think about this. If you think about this logically, I think it'll help. If it is true that because of Adam's sin, that we are all guilty, not because of our own sin, but because of Adam's sin, we're all guilty, that would have to mean that because of Christ's sacrifice, every single person is now forgiven. To be logically consistent with the passage, I think we'd have to do that. I don't think that's what the passage is saying. And so if that's not true, then we have to back it up and say, okay, well, I guess it can't be true either from the other side, that because of Adam, we are all guilty. No, we individually sin, and that is, I'm wholeheartedly convinced it is a choice, and it's something that we do. There's all kinds of other passages here, and
15 kind of explains that, doesn't it? I mean, or does it? No, I thought you did 16.
oh yeah, that was a better way to look at it. Free gift is not like transgression. Transgression of one, many died. Much more the grace of God, the gift of grace by one man abounds to the many. And oh, by the way, I guess I should say in the 10 seconds we have left, the word "all" in the Bible sometimes can be translated "many," and so it's like, ooh, what do you do with that? I will say, not every time, and I think it's Hebrews 9, maybe. I'll look this down somewhere. Okay, well, there's a passage in Hebrews that talks about I think it's Hebrews 2:9, actually. Everyone. And everyone kind of does mean everyone. We talked about barely one of the tenets of how to talk about that. Honestly, if we did all of those, that could be a whole quarter itself. Calvinism is deep. And I want you to think about, is there anything, and don't answer now, is there anything you want to talk about further with that? We'll start there on Sunday morning. See where we go, and then we'll move into lesson 7 after that. So, thank you for the class. Thank you for the discussion. A lot of stuff I don't know the answer to, but it was good stuff. Thank you guys.